The Biden-Harris campaign has been stepping up its criticism of former President Trump and the so-called Project 2025. It's, among other things, a set of conservative policy proposals that interest groups want to be implemented if Trump is elected. President Biden posted on social media last night telling voters to Google Project 2025. Joining us tonight to discuss this is Jordyn Hermani, Capitol reporter for Bridge, Michigan. Thanks for being here, Jordyn.
Thanks for having me.
So you've been doing a deep dive into this project. This is led by the Heritage Foundation out of Washington, a conservative think tank. And one of the things is it kind of includes a blueprint to reshape the federal government. What does that look like? What does that mean?
Well, so it's pretty wide-reaching, excuse me. It's a nearly 1,000-page policy agenda, and it calls for a number of things from dismantling the U.S. Department of Education altogether to urging the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to rescind its approval on the abortion-inducing drug mifepristone, to cracking down on immigration. There's any number of things within the document. And it effectively would be a large overhaul of how things at the federal level work should a Republican become president in November.
So considering those ideas, naturally, Democrats are sounding the alarm. President Biden said it will destroy America, but some Republicans are even distancing themselves from this. Why is that?
Well, I mean, when you look to what's being called out within the document, we talk about abortion. When Roe versus Wade was overturned, we saw states sweepingly across the nation start to try and move and introduce their own protections for the healthcare procedure into their own state law. So, in Michigan, for instance, in 2022, we codified the right to abortion access in our state constitution. What is called for within this policy proposal under Project 2025 would effectively circumvent everything that voters asked for during that last election. I mentioned the rescinding of the FDA's approval for mifepristone. Half of all abortions in Michigan in 2022 were done through use of that drug. We talk about another part of it calls for instituting the Comstock Act, and it's an act from the 1800s which calls for banning any substance that produces an abortion. You can't send those by mail anymore if that law were to go back into effect. Again, it would override the will of Michigan voters. And I don't particularly think that Republicans, especially in states like Michigan, which are rather purple, and on issues that are extremely touchy like that, it's not necessarily a winning policy issue for them. And so, especially at the state level, when you think about state level races, a lot of what's going on in Project 2025 deals with federal policies. So there really isn't even a reason for state level candidates, for instance, to try and insert themselves into this narrative. It's easier just to distance themselves altogether.
Sure. So that's the politicians themselves, but there is some support from conservative groups and institutions here in Michigan. Isn't that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, you think there's always going to be support for these kinds of initiatives somewhere. I mean, you look, and there are Michigan institutions that have actually played a role in crafting Project 2025. There is a professor of law at Michigan State University, actually, who wrote a portion of the policy manual with respect to the Federal Trade Commission. There are other smaller groups, such as the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, and another professor from Hillsdale College who were associated with crafting this policy proposal. And so there is obviously support in the background for this. And we've seen President Donald Trump in recent days try to distance himself from this. But, there are swaths of the party that are supportive of this. And, you can see that by the sheer fact of the matter that there are so many authors on this policy proposal. And again, some of them do come from Michigan.
Yeah. For those who don't know, how influential would you say the Heritage Foundation and those supporters who you just mentioned are on American politics?
So with respect to the Heritage Foundation, actually, we've seen them craft similar policy proposals like this before. They were integral in Newt Gingrich's Contract with America. It's a set of policy points that was released in the 90s. There was a very similar iteration of the Mandate for Leadership is the technical name for Project 2025's policy initiative There was also a mandate for leadership in the 1980s under President Reagan. It was about a 3,000-page document that the Heritage Foundation was also integral in crafting. And authors of that report actually say that they were successful in implementing about 60% of what was called for under former President Reagan's mandate for leadership. So there is some past precedent to suggest that if a Republican potentially does get in the White House come November, this is a foundation that has a history of success with advancing conservative policy agendas.
And based on what you've learned in your reporting, if former President Donald Trump is reelected, what are the chances that we do see some or all of this come to fruition?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say let's take this all with a grain of salt. You think about when candidates are on the campaign trail, they make promises all the time about things that they want to do once they get into office. Um, we do also have to think about the fact that the individual who is spearheading the director of Project 2025 is a former Trump administration official. There are numerous former Trump administration officials who have been a part of crafting this policy document. So yes, while the former President Donald Trump has attempted to distance himself from this, he does have allies that are behind this initiative, allies who may potentially end up also serving in another Trump administration should he be elected come November. So I wouldn't say that it's impossible for any of these policies to be implemented. I wouldn't also say it's impossible for very few of these. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of politics in America.
Yeah, a lot of questions this election season. Jordyn Hermani from Bridge, Michigan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.